everyone, and welcome to Coffee with Roelof. Hi everyone, and welcome to Coffee with Roelof. Coffee with Roelof. Coffee with Roelof.
Today we discuss the Entinology Planning Framework. To do that, I'm going to use a comparison with the normal old way of planning things opposed to the way that Entinology does or approach it. The reason I'm doing it that way is not to make a comparison between the two, but rather to give you a frame of reference that you understand and work towards the different alternative which we use in Entinology. I'm also going to give you a presentation view, and I know it's probably not the modern way of doing things, but it is the way that I present the classes, and I actually used this one yesterday when I presented a class. I just reduced a lot of the presentation just to give you a very quick overview. So I'm going to get cracking, and in order to do that, I'm just going to give you first the historical view of the planning and control method of planning, which normally started with current state assessment, then you had a future state, current state analysis, future state analysis, and then you had the gap analysis that you did. The gap analysis normally then was used to compile a business case. So that would essentially then be your scope that you will have to land, and in the business case you will commit to certain cost and time. So you commit to three things: cost, scope and time, and then you would go and execute it. In order to execute it, then you would do detailed business requirements, design, you will build, test, deploy and warranty period, which is normally your month after you land a project. The way all of this was conducted was using meetings, reporting, artifacts and control. A lot of control. The problem with this whole approach was that it was not cost effective. It wasn't time efficient. It increased risk. It increased meetings, extended testing, inefficiency, and it was very slow. It required your people that worked for you to become resources that were in robotic state. So it was very bad for innovation. It literally breaks Agile. Terrible at reporting, many dependencies that you had, and it was very expensive. There's 2 points I want to highlight, and that's the first one that I mentioned was increase of risk. I want to talk about increase of risk quickly. Increase of risk is very important because it seems like there's some confusion amongst people that the management and control approach actually reduces risk. It doesn't. It actually increases risk 100 times. First of all, management and control creates a very bad culture in any organization. It's horrible. Your culture is suddenly very much approach of think what you say, be very careful what you document, be very careful about what you write in mails and what you report on. Think carefully how you word your reports and how those reports will be interpreted by the readers. You also kind of have to anticipate higher up, not just your bosses but their bosses' bosses, how they will interpret those reports. So it means that reports isn't necessarily dishonest, but it often doesn't contain all the honesty it should. In some cases, you would also find that your boss might request you to move a project from red to amber or amber to green. There's all kinds of things that can happen. That's problematic. It increases risk. But there's also other things that it increases. For example, time. You think you've got enough contingency by adding 5 or 10% contingency to your cost to ensure that you got some kind of buffer for time. That is not how it works. You see, most projects, when you commit to a business case, you also assume that you already have done your estimations for the resources or the people that's going to do the work. The problem with that is, if you have two developers, one is senior and the other one is senior, but the one codes the same amount of code in 1 hour opposed to the 8 hours the other one codes it, Now let's say, for example, there is an 80% difference in the time it took the one to do the work opposed to the other. Both is good. It doesn't mean you need to fire the one. And if you do, it's probably going to take you time to replace him. But it means that the chances of you estimating that time accurately is nearly zero. Will the 5 or 10% contingency be enough? The next thing that you need to ask yourself is, often in planning, people don't include the amount of meetings they have to attend. For example, in your project team, you can isolate them as much as you like. They will probably only code 20 to 40% of their day. The rest of the time they'll be sitting in meetings that you never could plan for. Those meetings can be there to assist them in coding, to get more detail. And that's just the coders. I'm not even talking about analysts or designers, other people that you would require to get the job done. So that in itself already increases massive amounts of risk. Now, what's the treatment for that in the old days? It was to have raid log, raid sessions. We need to resolve these issues, log the risks, manage it, control it. That took a lot of time. That also increased the cost. And what if there's a scope change? You need to control it, so there's a formal process that needed to be followed. So all of these things contributed to increase of risk, but also in terms of bad reporting. So in terms of those 2 points I wanted to highlight, I just wanted to bring that to the fore, why I've got it on my list. So I'm going to move on to the next list, and here I'm looking more at how Entinology approaches things. Now, the first 2 points is just there to give you, the top of the pyramid is to give you an idea of how we approach things around planning. So we've broken it up into a vision, a long-term plan, and a vision is normally your 100-year plan. This is set there by the executive. It is a long-term plan. It gives you an idea of where we are going. The next one we're talking about, the long-term plan. It can be a 3, a 5 or a 10-year plan. It depends on how the executive plan the work. And this planning is often done at portfolio level, but even more senior than that. But we don't look at those two, the vision and the long-term plan, as part of what we teach or what we do. That leads to the next one, which is goals. So goals is extracted from the long-term plan. Those goals can be rolled up into a 12-month type of plan, what you want to achieve in the next 12 months, in order to successfully land your 3, 5 or 10-year plan that's part of your long-term plan. But that plan is done at a high level. It's never delved into detail. Now, up to this point, it might be already similar to what you're used to. I'm not sure if you do a 100-year plan, but if it is, that's probably what you're used to. Now, I want to ask you, because we've now gone top down, you understand how the things are led to the bottom, whether or not the previous way of doing things was indeed a good way of doing it. Because you literally jumped from the goals into detailed planning and you skipped everything else. There's a reason why we follow this path, and I'll explain that in terms of how we do reporting and automate reporting. But the next step is objectives. Now, objectives depends on what methodology you want to use to execute the work. Let's say it's Scrum, and you use a 1-week iteration because you're executing Scrum using XP or whatever. You want to use just a 1-week sprint. Therefore, your objectives will be tracked at a 6-week plan. Or maybe you want to use a 2-week sprint and you want to track your work at a 12-week plan level. And let's call that an incremental objective. The objectives is planned up to that point where you say, we need to land the following objectives to ensure the goals are successfully landed within the year. So it requires you to go and do a roadmap. Very high level, this is the work we want to plan so that we can execute it successfully and successfully land the goals. The next one is iterative goals, and the reason I'm using iterative goals is because Scrum, or sprint goal rather, that's very confusing because a goal is a very high level thing in my world. I am coming from a project management perspective, so goal is a roll-up of objectives, so it's kind of confusing to me, and therefore I make sure that we understand that it is an iterative goal, and that is what needs to land in the next week or 2 weeks of sprints. The detailed planning, which is then done down to subtask level and hourly planned. Now Agilist is now going to get a real heart attack, because how on earth can you plan hourly work? The reason you do that is simply to ensure your maturity in your planning, because the planning is done by the individuals themselves that's going to do the work, which leads to massively increased accuracy in planning. You can still use your planning poker, you can use t-shirt sizes to estimate and all that stuff. But when it comes to the planning of the work you're going to execute for that sprint, you want to use hours, because that gives you an idea of how long it will take you to do stuff. Anyway, the next step, I want to just give you an example of who does the planning. So in terms of your vision, the long-term plan and the goals, the executive normally takes care of that. Down to objectives, where your POCLAC, your product owners, your chapter leads and your agile coaches, they do the 1 week the objective planning. Objective planning normally takes about a week. And remember, none of the specialists is extracted from their teams to come and help. It's only those guys that do the planning. So your POCLAC needs to be people that's competent, that know what they are doing. But they're not going to do detailed planning, but they need to understand what needs to happen to get stuff done. The next one will be the iterative goals portion, which is then planned for about 4 hours by the squad, and that planning happens as well for the increment that the POCLAC is planning for. So it's 4 hours of their life for either 6 weeks or 12 weeks that they've invested in planning the iterative goals. The next one that happens is the detailed planning, and that happens every sprint. Now let's just zoom out a little bit. Do you have to land this with Scrum? I'm using Scrum just an example. I actually do like landing things with Scrum, because Scrum gives you the iterative approach of landing things. So anything that goes wrong, you pick it up immediately. The detailed planning portion of it literally takes the individual an hour to do. Then that work is planned down to a detail that gives them about a 90% success rate in estimating the duration. Yes, you heard it right, about a 90%. And you heard it right, it only takes them about an hour. But the detailed planning is done by the individuals that's going to do the actual work. The coding, the designs, the analysis, the testing. That is done at this level of detailed planning. Down to subtask level, down to hourly level. Now, I want to talk about how the flow works in terms of planning in Entinology. Planning informs the methodology that will be used. Personally, I'm very keen on XP. I like XP a lot. And the reason I like XP is it's very aggressive. And it literally makes sure that everybody, including the leadership, is involved and invested. I'm not talking about I'm paying for it, therefore I'm invested. I'm accountable, therefore I'm invested. You're not invested. You're not. If you're not involved, you're not invested. If you got the title and you're accountable, you're probably still not invested, because then you put control in place to make sure you've got control over things, which is not very clever. Invested means you're literally involved. You know what's going on. You're there. And that's what I like about XP. XP makes sure that the people doing the actual work is in control of their work. So everybody else is serving them. It's also very fast, efficient, good code quality. There's so many benefits. It's similar to TDD. Yes, you can go and use Scrum normally, and you can go and use Lean. The point is your planning informs the methodology. So methodology then leads to delivery. And here's a very important thing. Governance has never, ever led to delivery. That's not the whole point of governance. Governance isn't there to ensure delivery. And there's a lot of confusion with people that think, governance needs to be there to ensure we deliver. No, that's not what governance is about. So governance ensures risk is managed. What does that mean? It means that my executive knows exactly what's happening. Now, to do that, you need to remove reporting and institute transparency, which means my CEO can go onto Jira, pull a report, and know exactly what's happening on the smallest project in his organization. He knows exactly. That comes with a responsibility though. He can't now react emotionally or stressed out and cause havoc. He needs to understand he's got visibility on a complete transparent platform, which means there's space for improvement in communication. Often developers can't communicate that great, so you're going to see a lot of detail, but you know what's cool. You're going to know exactly what's happening, what is really in production, what is really in QA, UAT, where are we really, without asking people. You know what's going on. Right, the next thing is efficiency. Efficiency lowers cost, delivery at momentum, and governance as an accidental benefit. I want to be very spiteful around governance because I want to push that envelope a bit as an accidental benefit. Because governance is actually an outstanding way of interpreting information. To ensure that governance is accidental means that you need to put discipline in your organization in the use of tools. And that tools can be DevOps, Jira, Confluence, it doesn't matter what tools, but you need to have automation, you need to have all these tools implemented in your organization. By enforcing that discipline means that people need to utilize those tools correctly. That brings with it massive amount of benefits. Right, I want to go back to point 2, methodology results in delivery. And then I state there such an important thing there at efficiency, and that is delivery at momentum. What does that mean? There's methodologies out there that call themselves frameworks that's talking about cadence. And cadence is rhythm. Planning happens at rhythm. You do planning at rhythm. You don't execute at rhythm. Execution needs to flow. It needs to run all the time. Never stops. That needs to carry momentum. If you have to interrupt your team that's actually doing work 2 weeks every program increment to do planning, you've literally taken them out of work for a month and a half. For what? Why? That's stupidity. You don't need to do that. If you do your planning at the right level, your team can continuously deliver and do their planning at a momentum. Sometimes it will take 4 hours, and as they get better it will take 3, 2, 1. The personal planning, it really takes less than an hour. It probably takes them an hour and a further hour or two to populate it in Jira. In some cases, they will use Excel to plan, others use Mind Manager. There's all kinds of tools they use. But the point is, your team is not supposed to be out of work for 2 weeks to plan. Planning don't do any kind of delivery. Planning leads to delivery and needs to be done at the right level. The way that governance is approached in Entinology is by using the Entinology diamond. Governance is documented around the customer, the process, data, technology and infrastructure, the different channels in the organization, location, if there's any regulatory dependency on that, regulatory requirements, organization itself, and then software application. Organization itself will be carried around policies, standard documentation, KPIs of your executive, etc., etc. Whatever applies to lead to the governance being compiled. Governance is not a standard practice aligned to your methodology. Let me repeat that. Governance is not a standard practice to align it to methodology. That is the wrong way to do governance. If your PMO is doing it that way, they're doing it wrong. The way governance should work is look at your risk exposure of your executive, look at the policies and standards, use the Entinology diamond, look at all those aspects and make sure your governance is aligned to that. Then implement the tools that can automate that for you. Create transparency and take away all the risk as much as you possibly can in any case for your executive. Remember, your executive is your most important people in your organization. The delivery, as I've explained before, the vision, the long-term plan, goals, objectives, etc. That happens with the pyramid and the way the planning happens there. And then you've got your tools and artifacts that sits in your tool sets, which is your testing software. And remember, automation of testing is a requirement for Entinology to work well. You will use Jira or similar tool sets. We actually don't use Jira in Entinology itself, but I found that Jira is used most in your corporate organizations, in South Africa in any case. Then Confluence is very useful as well. This is all built on the foundation of corporate policies and procedures, monitoring and internal controls, regulatory frameworks, your organizational structure, transparency, key to that, and your legal entity and governance framework. So for example, a public company that has shares will definitely look different to a non-public company that does not have shares that trade on some kind of stock exchange. And then on the right hand side, I just gave you a taste of what methodologies Entinology have been tested before, and that is DevOps, Scrum, Waterfall, Kanban, TDD, XP, SDLC, Lean, and so forth. So there's been a couple of the methodologies that we've used. You can also use it for infrastructure projects, procurement projects, regulatory projects, innovation, software solution deployments, and then project audits, etc. It's quite useful, especially the governance part. The Entinology diamond is utilized for maturity frameworks. It's very useful. It's got a multi-dimension to it. Now, when it comes to different methodologies and different project types, it's quite useful to understand why we approach things using different methods. For example, your critical path method, very useful when you have to land infrastructure, very useful when you have to land regulatory projects. But regulatory projects is very interesting because it actually normally contains a lot of different facets. So you might have a little bit of innovation in there. You might have to deploy infrastructure for encryption or whatever. It depends on what the regulatory requirements is. But you're definitely going to purchase software, and you have to do some current state, future state, and gap analysis, because all of that information needs to be reflected when you report to the regulator, to give them an idea of what your match is in terms of legislation requirements around what you've actually implemented. So often regulatory projects, you will use a multi-methodology to execute, but you will definitely use some form of waterfall to track the progress. Project audits is also very interesting. The diamond's very useful there because it enables you to get a proper view of how things have been planned and executed. Anyway, that is a short overview of how Entinology does planning. Hopefully this will be very interesting to you and perhaps provoke a few questions and debates, healthy debates. Thank you guys. Have an awesome day.